good evening, everybody. It is time for some more liberal lies. Well, well, I still say lies about American history, not necessarily liberal lies. But anyway, um, if you were here last time, you may have noticed that the session, the stream ended very abruptly. It's because my computer froze up. I don't know where I was when I was reading this one about Lee Harvey Oswald. It's only 3 pages, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump back into it and read it. In fact, the next 3 in a row are 3 pages each, so we'll be able to get through several tonight. I don't know if I've got the problem solved, but I think it's at least more stable than it was. So let's just do this. So this is lie 20. Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK because he was a deranged Marine, not because he was a communist. One quote. Oswald was a troubled former Marine. That's Eric Fauner, Give Me Liberty. Okay, so a majority of textbooks identify John F. Kennedy's killer as, quote, a 24-year-old ex-Marine drifter, end quote. That's Tyndall and She, America. And a, quote, 24-year-old misfit who had served in the Marines, end quote. That is Goldfield et al., American Journey. Morrison, Commager, and Luchtenberg's Concise History of the American Republic noted Oswald, quote, had once expatriated himself to Russia, end quote. Note, not the Soviet Union. Boydston et al. In Making a Nation described him as, quote, a quiet former Marine who spent time in the Soviet Union, end quote. Harrell et al. In Unto a Good Land added to the typical description of Oswald as a quote-unquote deeply disturbed former Marine the key identifying factor and self-professed Marxist. Which is another part of the quote, sorry. Why do you suppose these textbooks eagerly describe Oswald as a Marine, but only one mentioned he was a Marxist, and none correctly identify him as what he was, a self-described communist? Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which does not deal with JFK's death, but does not even mention Oswald, possibly because to do so would require acknowledging his communist sympathies. Likewise, James W. Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me avoids any mention of Oswald. In fact, however, as a new book by James Pearson shows, Oswald's communism was the motivating factor in his murder of the president, though leftists, including historians such as Arthur Schlesinger, conveniently omitted any reference to Oswald's communism. Pearson notes that the assassination of a popular president by a communist should have generated a revulsion against everything associated with left-wing doctrines, yet something very close to the opposite happened. Instead, that was a quote. Quote, the assassination of the popular president, blah, 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 opposite happened, end quote. Instead, the historians routinely described Oswald as, quote, emotionally unstable and one whose actions were never fully explained, end quote. Not fully explained unless, of course, you take Oswald's own words at face value. When conspiracy theories are presented, they almost uniformly are related to the CIA, not communists. The Warren Commission's, quote, decision to protect CIA secrets, end quote, says American Destiny, quote, engendered skepticism toward the Commission and the United States government, end quote. In other words, while noting that, quote, God, I fucking hate this, quote, there is little solid evidence to suggest Oswald as part of a wider conspiracy, end quote. The authors go on to suggest that if such a conspiracy existed, it certainly must involve CIA secrets. After warning that, quote, the president was not universally loved and admired, the far right despised him, end quote. These United States goes on to identify Oswald as, quote, an unstable leftist who had spent years in the Soviet Union and been active in the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba organization, end quote. The author then plunges into the toll of the assassination, which was that, quote, more and more Americans concluded that there was an evil plot afoot or a conspiracy of them, end quote. In the mother of all cop-outs, the enduring vision cannot even bring itself to state that Oswald killed Kennedy, instead noting, quote, shots rang out, the president slumped. Americans spent the next 4 days in front of their television sets, staring at replays of the murder of accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, end quote. It is astonishing, however, that even among the texts that admit Oswald was a leftist who spent considerable time in the Soviet Union, virtually none of them can take the next step and assume it was because of Oswald's communist sympathies that he killed Kennedy. As Pearson noted, liberal writers in the 20th century had a monopoly on describing conspiracy theorists as irrational, often right-wing, anti-intellectual bumpkins. This was the thesis of Richard Hofstadter's essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Yet suddenly, as radical leader Todd Gitlin said, the leaders of the New Left were, quote, fascinated by conspiracy theories, impressed by their critiques of the Warren Commission, doubtful of the single assassin idea, end quote. Quite the contrary, liberal textbook writers had to disassociate Oswald from communism, following the lead of liberal iconographers such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his 1,000 Days. The new historical narrative was that the nation as a whole, quote-unquote, killed Kennedy. The Rolling Stones got in on the act with their 1968 song Sympathy for the Devil, where Mick Jagger sings, for want of a better term, I shouted out, who killed the Kennedys? When after all, it was you and me. That was a quote, of course. A shame-based reframing of the Kennedy assassination where tragedy was a quote-unquote instrument of punishment for national sins trickled into the textbooks. By the time Robert Kennedy was assassinated, a new punitive liberalism has replaced the old John Kennedy-esque muscular liberalism. As Pearson puts it, liberals, quote, began to argue that the purpose of national policy was more to punish the nation for its sins than to build a brighter and more secure future for all. The focus of reform was to compensate those groups that had suffered as a consequence of cruel policies and customs in the past, end quote. It therefore became the purpose of history text to document those past sins and unjust policies, not to present an honest, balanced story in which the United States overall was a quote-unquote shining city on a hill, which is the case. We have Lee Harvey Oswald to blame not only for killing a charismatic president, but also for permanently poisoning the optimism of a generation, a diabolical historical twofer that was uniquely destructive. Historians have not hesitated to accept other presidential assassins at face value. Most texts, for example, identify John Wilkes Booth as a Confederate or Confederate sympathizer. One textbook calls Booth a, quote, disgruntled Southern actor, end quote, and another a, quote, crazed actor and Confederate zealot, end quote. Only a few fail to mention that Booth was a die-hard Confederate. Perhaps it's time to identify John Kennedy's killer as the communist assassin that he was. Well, I take a little bit of an exception to, well, a lot of an exception to this. While I don't doubt his communist ties and that maybe that was his motivation, at least in part, I firmly believe that our CIA did have something to do with it. Whether it was, giving him the information he needed to be in the right place at the right time, putting him up to it, or what, I don't know. But I have no doubt that they did have something to do with it. And a lot more information has come out about them since. So, and that they have had a hand, or they did have a hand in it. So, again, written in 2006, 7, whatever. So, all right, moving straight on into the next one. It looks like everything's doing okay at the moment. So, Lie 21. Columbus was responsible for killing millions of Indians. And this one's only 3 pages. So, Columbus was responsible for killing millions of aliens. So, three quotes. Estimates of Haiti's pre-Columbian population range as high as 8 million people. When Christopher Columbus returned to Spain, the census of Indian adults in 1496 was 1.1 million. That's John W. Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me. When Hernando Cortez and his Spanish army of fewer than 1,000 men stormed into Mexico in 1519, the native population numbered about 22 million. By the end of the century, following a series of devastating epidemics, only 2 million people remained. That's Bruce Stutz, Discover Magazine, February 21st, 2006. For North America alone, estimates of native populations in Columbus's day range from 2 to 18 million. By the end of the 19th century, the population had shrunk to about 530,000. And that is David J. Meltzer, How Columbus Sickened the World, The New Scientist, October 10th, 1992. All right. Wow, just wow. One wonders how any publisher would release such drivel, let alone any writer actually write it. Do you know what the population of Haiti is as of 2007? According to the CIA World Factbook, 8.7 million. That's right. More than 400 years after Columbus explored Haiti, when there were supposedly 8 million people living there, the population hasn't changed, despite a skyrocketing population growth since 1961. To think that any pre-modern civilization could eliminate 7 million people in just over 2 years defies all logic, not to mention history. Remember, Columbus's original voyage consisted of only 3 ships, a carack and 2 caravels. Normally, none of these ships could carry more than 100 men. When Columbus returned on a second voyage, this time to Haiti in 1493, he had over 1,000 men total. Perhaps a mathematician trained in ergonomics could explain how 1,000 men, of course many died en route or were sick, could kill 7 million people in 3 years. If one begins with assumptions that such astronomical numbers of Indians or Native Americans existed in the first place, then when somewhat reliable census methods became available and showed a fraction of that, one is left with no other conclusion than the Columbian Exchange killed most of the natives in the New World. Of course, if one begins with the assumption that the sun is cold, then explaining sunburn will be impossible. Assumptions are important, and when it comes to determining the impact of European diseases, and yes, violence and slavery, on natives in the New World, they are necessary for purposes of measurement. In the past, ridiculous numbers have been thrown about. One author claimed 56 million people died as a result of European exploration in the Americas. But for such numbers to be even remotely true, the starting population had to be 100 million or more. Most recent research puts the entire native population on both continents and the islands of the New World at 53 million. But an interesting trend has been that with each new study, the population estimates fall. Since 1976, the experts lowered their estimates by 4 million. More conservative estimates are that there were a total of, on the high side, 8.5 million for all of North America and a low estimate of only 1.8 million. The quote-unquote European genocide crowd has more Indians being killed or dying of disease than even existed in all the New World put together. Furthermore, historians have used unrealistic flexibility in determining when diseases first appear and who introduced them. One study of 12,500 skeletons from 65 burial sites found that pre-Columbian disease was rampant, and some have speculated that a non-venereal form of syphilis was involved. Several anthropologists, including Henry Dobbins, now subscribe to the early epidemic theory of depopulation. In other words, disease was killing large numbers of natives long before the first Spaniard ever waded ashore. Daniel Reff has argued for a thorough reconsideration wow, I don't know, reconsideration of disease as the primary source of depopulation, and does not support the inflated numbers. David Hennig correctly labels these fabulously high estimates as, quote, numbers from nowhere, end quote. Some truth is slipping out, however. Rodolfo Acuna Soto, although accepting the extraordinarily high numbers, attributes the death to hemorrhagic fevers transmitted by rodent hosts. Acuna Soto, I don't know, found that epidemics coincided with many Spanish invasions and would look like Europeans caused illnesses for which they were not responsible at all. This introduces a remarkable dilemma. On the one hand, James Lowen and others castigate history teachers for ignoring quote-unquote Afro-Phoenician voyages for which almost no evidence exists. Wrong again, I think, by writing, quote, unlike the Norse, the Afro-Phoenicians seem to have made a permanent impact on the Americas, end quote. And if that's true, however, then all of the claims about a quote-unquote biologically naive or virgin soil spread of European diseases must be completely rejected, as the Afro-Phoenicians infected the Indians first. Moreover, no one bothered to keep track of how many other Indians killed in warfare. Not only did most Indians not keep records of how many enemy they wiped out, different tribal customs sometimes deliberately overestimated and sometimes deliberately underestimated the actual casualties. It's a reasonable assumption that as many were killed in warfare with each other as in conflicts with Europeans, but it's well known that the Aztecs slaughtered hundreds of thousands in religious ceremonies. Scholars who looked at southwestern regions found entirely abandoned or depopulated areas that are dated to a century before Columbus arrived. Where once scholars dismissed Spaniards' accounts of decaying great houses or empty villages, they now are revisiting these observations with an eye toward other explanations. Victor Davis Hansen estimates that the Aztecs alone killed 20,000 a year every year in their ritual sacrifices, and the author of Aztec Warfare puts the number killed at a single ceremony in 1487 at between 10,000 and 80,000. Perhaps anti-Columbus Indian George P. Horsecapture, who said, quote, no sensible Indian person can celebrate the arrival of Columbus, meant no sensible Indian other than those who survived the Aztec slaughters, end quote. And that is the end of that one. I just want to check on everything here. Oh yeah, my temperatures are doing good. Everything seems to be pretty stable. So I'm going to keep on trucking. So I think he's right for the most part there. Other than the Afro-Phoenician voyages, I think there were a whole lot of people traveling here by by boat long before archaeologists, anthropologists, paleontologists are willing to admit, historians. Okay, at least for the time being. All right, lie 22. The early colonies were intolerant and racist. Two quotes. Puritans sought to convert the tribes to Christianity. They considered the natives to be wild pagans incapable of fully utilizing nature's bounty. That's George Brown Tyndall and David E. Shea, America, A Narrative History. Chapter 5, Gone with the Wind, The Invisibility of Racism in American History Textbooks. And that is James W. Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And again, this one's only 3 pages. Oh, no, it's 4 pages. I lied. Okay. Were American colonies bent on racism and racial slavery when they originated? In fact, there was no original concept of racial slavery when the nation was first settled by Europeans. As Yale historian Edmund S. Morgan points out, blacks often were viewed the same as white indentured servants and became free as soon as their indenture was up. Until the 1670s, American colonists looked to white indentured servants, not Africans, as their main source of labor. In 1644, some southern colonies declared slavery hereditary, but when they did, they weren't inventing a new way to be racist. They merely had returned to a practice that was established throughout the Muslim world and accepted across the entire globe, including in the French and British empires. It must also be remembered that at this point, the Muslim slave trade, mostly of Europeans, dwarfed the slave trade involving black Africans. Free blacks were common, especially in the North. In 1621, for example, Antonio the Negro was identified in public records in Virginia, and of the 300 blacks living in the South up to 1640, many, if not most, had gained freedom simply through the expiration of their indenture contracts. Some became landholders and even slaveholders. About 10% of all blacks were free, 90% slave, but there were free blacks in early America. One Marylander, Matthias de Souza, was an indentured servant who was the first black to vote in America and served in the 1642 Legislative Assembly. The Assembly's proceedings listed him alongside the other members. Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation resolution in 1780, Rhode Island in 1784, the state of New York formed a manumission society in 1785, and New York abolished slavery in 1799, some 30 years before England ended slavery in her empire. Vice President Aaron Burr, who would later shoot former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton in a duel, lobbied for immediate emancipation for all New York slaves right after the Revolution ended. Free blacks were voting in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and several other states prior to the Civil War. In some cases, despite their relatively small numbers, the community of free blacks who voted swung an election. Indeed, even before they were free, blacks in the Northeast held Election Day, on the day when free white voters would cast their ballots, at which time they elected their own governors and spokesmen. While some might ridicule such actions as meaningless gestures, lacking real democracy and power, in fact, they showed whites, on the one hand, that blacks could govern themselves in respectable European ways, and on the other, gave blacks practice at self-government for when the time came that they would be emancipated. Interracial marriage was not initially illegal in the colonies, and apparently was not entirely uncommon. Maryland, for example, did not ban interracial marriages, but did punish free white women who married slaves. Not until 1717 did Maryland prohibit black-white intermarriage. Most colonies did not originally forbid interracial marriages, and such laws were not passed until the 1660s. But surprisingly, this is the same time frame in which black slavery started to become hereditary. By 1676, legalized hereditary slavery appeared in Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and was soon established as an institution in virtually all the American colonies. Yet it is also important to note that while slavery was deeply embedded in the American past, as it was again virtually everywhere else, Americans were the first to form an anti-slavery society in 1775, when the Quakers, who ingrained the concept of abolition in the national soul, when the Quakers also ingrained, and Northern reformers began passing manumission acts in the late 1700s. Saudi Arabia and the Sudan are still awaiting their manumission acts. Yes, they are. Treatment of Indians was far more uneven, given the different cultures of the northern and southern tribes, some with quite European, quote unquote, European ways. There was also the simple reality that until 1763, the English colonists needed Indian allies to ward off the French, and each tribe played its own version of power politics. Many tribes in New England welcomed the English as a counterbalance to the hated Pequots, until the activist removal of the Cherokee by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Indians, quote, lived partially assimilated lives on the margins of the dominant society, end quote. Some Indians had already, quote, forgotten their ancient names and nearly all their Indian language, end quote. Of course, to the Native American activists, this kind of assimilation was abominable, but it hardly represented, quote unquote, intolerance and racism. The Puritans, while viewing Indians as culturally inferior, embraced no doctrine of racial inferiority when it came to Native Americans. Indeed, some Puritan teachings held that the Indians descended from the Jews, the lost tribe of Israel. Certainly, the lust for land on the part of the white settlers cannot be denied, but as we discussed at length in A Patriot's History of the United States, this was as much grounded in a fundamental and unbreachable difference in the very notion of property rights that came from a paper title as it was in pure greed. Plains Indians did not conceive of European-style private property rights, although neither were they Marxist communists who shared everything, and eventually an irrepressible conflict, quote unquote, was bound to arise between one culture that insisted land could be owned and fenced in, and another that said it could not. New England Indians had extensive land rights systems and often eagerly sold land. Some Indians were simply pushed off their lands, especially as one moved further west. The concept of property rights became less European. Colonists routinely granted Indians hunting rights on their own lands, happy to obtain the furs that the Indians would provide. Over time, it could be argued that once settlers realized that the Indians did not have European concepts of property rights, as embodied in the large fenced-in farms, they developed a what the heck attitude and used blunt force to obtain what would inevitably become theirs through the European-based legal system. For the most part, however, in the 1600s, quote, deeds of sale usually were so specific as to leave little room for misunderstanding. When disputes arose between Puritans and Indians over land sales, they most often involved questions of boundaries, not privileges, end quote. Such an absence of private property rights made conflict inevitable. However, up until the time of Jackson's violent removal of the Cherokee, the U.S. Supreme Court was tending toward recognizing full Indian rights to land regardless of any national interest from the U.S. government. Congress recognized Indian rights of soil in 1786 when simultaneously established treaties to take it away with a cash purchase. Later, however, the presence of these contract rights would help the Indians defend their lands. In other ways, the colonists were remarkably tolerant of the natives, where virtually any other kingdom or empire, Mongols or Muslims come to mind, would have simply wiped them out or completely subjugated them. Harvard admitted Indian students early in its history. Colonists could be tried and put to death for murdering Indians. John Eliot, a missionary to the Algonquins in Massachusetts, learned their language and translated the Bible into Algonquin. The Pequots received a colonial grant from the King of England that acknowledged the political rights of Indians. Some New England courts ruled in favor of Indians who claimed their land had been stolen. In matters of religion, the very fact that so many different denominations and sects practiced side by side is telling. At a time when England and France had state-sponsored churches, the American colonies had separate Anglican, Catholic, Puritan, Baptist, and Quaker churches, as well as watered-down versions of each. Methodism appeared when George Whitefield arrived in 1641. New Light Christianity began to spread, and Presbyterianism arrived. It was a free market of religious ideas and toleration, unseen in almost any part of the world. Toleration had its limits. While no Catholic in his right mind would march into Salem or Boston and begin preaching that all Puritans were going to hell, even obnoxious religious zealots such as Quakers, who frequently ventured into congregational territory, were given multiple warnings before punishment was imposed. This stood in marked contrast to Europe, where the King of France would burn Knights Templars, the organization of Crusader Knights, which had become essentially a society of bankers, at the stake for heresy just to get his hands on their money. But in America, by 1800, major seminaries were already educating Unitarians who denied the divinity of Christ. How's that for toleration? And that's the end of that one. Cool. That's 3 articles in 34 minutes. I'm reading fast tonight, though. I'm going to do one more. It is 6 pages, but that'll put us back on track where we were. It also puts us so that next time we're starting lie 24 of the 48. I'm assuming some of these are going to be... Oh, there's quite a long... Okay, hold on. Now that I looked, I have to look some more. There's a really long bibliography. Starting right there. Okay, so the 24 will be the midway point. The rest of them, it's about equal. So there's going to be some mostly 6-pagers, 4 to 6 pagers, I would guess. But maybe we'll step it up a little bit. I'll try to start doing one more per session. Now that I've got this, well, I'm not going to jinx myself. I hope I've got the problem fixed. Okay, lie 23. Early America was home to few guns or gun owners. Really? I've never heard that one before. Okay. Gun ownership was, there's one quote, gun ownership was exceptional in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. Michael Belisles, Arming America. What a crock of shit that is. I bet you there wasn't a person in America that couldn't handle a gun during the colonial era. God. Okay, here we go. As whoppers about American history go, this one is fairly new and was refuted in what was to be record time when it comes to academic review processes. It was largely the result of one book, Arming America, The Origins of a National Gun Culture, in which author Michael Belisles, I guess, I don't know how to pronounce that, claimed few people owned guns in early America, even on the frontier. The firearms market only developed, he claimed, after industrialization, and only then with the help of the government. Most militiamen showed up to fight without weapons, and in fact, Belisles argued the government, quote-unquote, failed in the task of arming its citizens. Shame on that incompetent American government. Of course, the truth is obvious to most 10-year-olds who know that no one went into any frontier area unless armed to the teeth. Boys and girls learned to shoot at early ages, and except for a Bible and skillet, the most commonly found item in any American home, no matter how poor, was always a musket or rifle, often several. James Lindgren, a professor of law at Northwestern University, concluded that, quote, household gun ownership in early America was more widespread than today in a much poorer world, end quote. Belisles used his purported evidence to launch into an attack on the quote-unquote gun culture, especially controversial positions such as whether automatic weapons should be banned, whether certain ammunition, quote-unquote cop killer bullets, was constitutional, and of course the widespread availability of guns contributing to high gun violence rates. The dirty little secret is that the international data shows that gun restrictions increase crime and even homicides. Or, put another way, when all countries are considered, people are much safer in nations that have fewer gun laws rather than more. This evidence is extensive. In Finland, just as one example, where there are 32 privately owned firearms per 100 people, the firearm homicide rate is lower than in Italy, where only 16% of the households have guns. Relying on shop-worn myths about lower crime and homicide rates in non-gun owning nations, Belisles opined that, quote, the gun is so central to American identity that the nation's history has been meticulously reconstructed to promote the necessity of having a heavily armed American public, end quote. For someone who routinely invoked Gordon Wood, R.G. Collingwood, and other historians who caution that sources should be tested against generalizations, Belisles needed to add and against facts, quote unquote. It's also telling that in his chapter-long history of the, quote, European gun heritage, end quote, Belisles does not mention Henry II's famous Assize of Arms, which laid the groundwork for requiring every man, noble or plain freeman, to be armed. The author misrepresented the conclusions of Thomas Esper, who argued that while English longbows were superior in the hands of trained archers, the training took years of practice, whereas a musketeer could be effective within a few weeks of musket practice. Claiming the first settlers were complete buffoons in using firearms, which in his view was nearly useless due to difficulties in loading and firing, he never explained why the Indians were so desperate to acquire these ineffective weapons, and on and on. The errors in this book were obvious early on, and they were multitudinous, so much so that Clayton Kramer wrote a book-length manuscript examining and disproving Belisles' endnotes. He also wrote an extensive response to Belisles' condensation of his book in article form that appeared in the Journal of American History. Astonishingly, Kramer's response, detailing the severe deficiencies in scholarship involved in Belisles' article, was not published because, after the journal sat on it for 2 years, the editors then claimed it was a bit late to directly critique the original article. The upshot was that the original article, replete with massive source problems, remained a published article in the most prestigious Journal of American History, while editors declined to publish the piece that would have recorded the accurate history of guns in America. In 2007, Kramer's rebuttal manuscript became a book, Armed America, the story of how and why guns became as American as apple pie. Nashville, Thomas Nelson, 2007. There were serious errors on almost every page of Belisles' book. The notion, for example, that militias showing up without guns was somehow indicative of the fact that they did not have guns was absurd. It showed precisely the opposite, that early Americans treasured their personal firearms and were not going to take them into combat, but rather expected the government to furnish a gun. Indeed, after the first days of the Revolution, American militiamen well knew that their hunting rifles, while far better at long range, were nearly useless in close combat because they lacked bayonets, which the government muskets had. Excuse me. In all of Belisle's publications, Kramer argued that the error was not the result of careless mistakes, but rather that Belisle engaged in deliberate falsifications. This theme was expanded by Kramer in a journal devoted to exposing plagiarism and fraud. Plagiary. What made Kramer's investigation of arming America so exceptional was that, unlike other early critics, Kramer was a gun enthusiast and software engineer who worked entirely outside the academy. Of course, anti-gun critics such as John Weiner in The Nation tried to smear Kramer precisely because of his amateur status, only to make an incredible number of errors themselves. While the battle of the reviews was unfolding, Emory University released its report stating that Belisle was, quote, guilty of unprofessional and misleading work, end quote, and the panel found, quote unquote, evidence of falsification. Even after confronted with the evidence, it was not clear that Belisle, quote, fully understands the magnitude of his own probate research shortcomings, end quote. In other words, even after Emory showed him his errors, he was in denial. But long before that, Kramer found, and now we have a bullet list of a couple of things, just a couple, 3. First one, when citing the Militia Act of 1792, Belisle changed the phrase every citizen shall within 6 months provide himself with a weapon to shall be constantly provided, then claimed Congress would provide that weapon. In fact, the individuals were perfectly capable of providing their own. Belisle quoted George Washington as condemning the militia in general as poorly armed, when in fact he was criticizing only specific units. He declared, third one, he conflated statistics of state militia weapons and those in the government armories with all weapons in private hands to arrive at a figure of 250,000 guns in America, when there were, according to the government records, at least 250,000 guns in the hands of state militias alone. Okay. When scholars finally smelled the odor and began investigating Belisle's archival documents, the stink grew worse. James Lindgren, a probate law expert, notes that while probate evidence appeared in only 13 pages of the book, that evidence was central to his argument because it was the only data showing consistent change over time. More evidence of fraud surfaced, however, when Belisle told Lindgren that he had read some 10,000 microfilm probated inventories at East Point, Georgia's federal archives. In fact, the records had never been processed or microfilmed. The probate records Belisle relied on from San Francisco had been destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. When confronted with that tidbit of information, Belisle claimed to have, quote-unquote, located the documents and even sent for them myself, end quote. He must have had a time machine to obtain those records. Confronted yet again a year later by Emory University officials, he, quote-unquote, completely forgot which of the archives he had used. One wonders why Detroit cannot turn out a decent time machine anymore. That's kind of out of whack there. Okay. A reporter from the Boston Globe found that Belisle's own website, which claimed early guns were of poor quality, had coincidentally omitted dozens of guns in estates and had altered the descriptions of guns in Vermont probate records to support his point. Belisle claimed that his website was hacked, perhaps by the same gremlins that damaged his time machine. After trying yet again to make the Vermont records yield a conclusion he liked, Belisle introduced a new set of probate records that still omitted most of the guns in estates, verified by Lindgren, Justin Heather, Randolph Roth, and David Mahagan. Pressed by Emery to respond to critics, Bellassiles offered a statement on the website of the Organization of American Historians in November 2001, yet did not answer a single charge that was raised, only new criticism he invented. In January 2002, the William and Mary Quarterly devoted much of its issue to the debate and allowed Bellassiles to respond, but again he ducked the obvious and most damaging issues. The ball completely unraveled after that. Columbia University had awarded Bellassiles the Bancroft Prize for works of, quote, distinguished merit and distinction, end quote, and no one could argue that arming America wasn't distinct in its fallacious logic, and some sources that simply appeared to have vanished. Many of those who had endorsed Bellassiles' book on the jacket and in promotion, including Gary Wills, slowly began to question their support, then withdraw it. The National Endowment for the Humanities removed Bellassiles from the Newberry Library Fellowship in June 2002. Pressure on Emory University increased after an internal investigation suggested unprofessional practices were present, and the university finally consented to establish a panel of quote-unquote distinguished scholars from other universities to review the case. In October 2002, the panel found, quote, evidence of falsification and serious failures of and carelessness in gathering the presentation of archival records and the use of quantitative evidence, end quote. The report found in one case that of supposed records from 38 jurisdictions, astonishingly few fragments of Bellassiles' research actually existed, and, quote, neither he in his subsequently published data nor any other scholar has been able to replicate the low percentages of guns reported in those tables, end quote. Addressing the destroyed San Francisco archives, Bellassiles later claimed they were in Contra Costa, California, and he just mixed up the two. In fact, he didn't even check the San Francisco records until after his research was called into question. And even then, the records he, thanks to his burst of memory, recalled reading in Contra Costa in 1993 were not placed there until 1998. The time machine malfunction seems to have gotten worse as the case dragged on. The committee noted that, quote, the records he selected and photocopied from that Contra Costa archive are hardly random, but explicitly chosen because they had the words San Francisco in them, even though they clearly came from Contra Costa's court, end quote. In his final report to Emory, the committee could not judge, quote-unquote, intentionality, but were, quote-unquote, seriously troubled by Bellassiles' scholarly conduct. Further, the committee found that, quote, the failure to clearly identify his sources did move into the realm of falsification, and that he had deliberately omitted data from Alice H. Jones because it contradicted his own, end quote. Bellassiles resigned from Emory on the day the report was released, and Columbia University's trustees finally saw the light and rescinded the Bancroft Prize they had awarded to Bellassiles for his scholarship. Most telling was the response of those academics who had touted Bellassiles' work, including Gary Wills and Roger Lane. Wills labeled the book a fraud and said, quote, people get taken by very good con men, end quote. They do when they are already half in the tank for whatever the con men are selling. As Wills added, Bellassiles, quote, did not have to do it since he had good evidence for many of his claims, end quote. Which claims were those, Wills did not say. Most telling were the comments by Roger Lane, who had first reviewed the book positively in the Journal of American History. Quote, he betrayed us. He's betrayed the cause, end quote. The cause? I doubt seriously that the cause is honest, accurate history. More likely the cause was gun control, itself a topic drenched in poor research and bogus statistics. As with so many of the left's arguments, the only way to win is to cheat. And that is the end of that. That was a good one. That's the end of that. Lie 23. So lie 24 next time, which is Abraham Lincoln only freed the slaves to beef up his troop strength. That is lie 24 that we'll get to next time. And it looks like everything's good. The temperatures are good. Everything seems to be doing really well now. So hopefully the picture is, or the picture, heck am I saying? Hopefully the problem is solved. So that'll be that for tonight. Mr. Blitzer is playing Serious Sam. We've got some Final Fantasy. What is that? 14. We've got some Minecraft. No. Helldivers 2. Mario versus Donkey Kong. Let's see. Let's go check out Helldivers 2. That's Gritty Phoenix. So I will see you over there in just a minute.
Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better. I wanna back, that's all you want. Me, I'm back, trying to get me free. That I attacked you. That's just
Oh, it's saying we are unable to raid Gritty Phoenix at this time. So, all right. Well, I guess we'll just skip it tonight then. So, all right. I will see you next time. I'm so scared, my house cannot run this. Always be watched by that's so sit on privacy. The static, probably haven't heard of it. Need to live a different life, just like cameras on.